Hello, welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. We anticipate more folks showing up, hopefully, given it was sold out. But to make the most use of our time, we're going to go ahead and just jump in with the welcome and an intro before we jump into the findings. So, thanks everyone for coming to Coming Home, Navigating Turbulent Times in Housing and Movement Work. My name is Dominique Miller. I am the co-director of Spire and Base, where we support learning, research, and strategy work that advances equitable practices in community development, arts and culture, and creative placemaking. And just want to thank you all so much for your time today. And just thank you for your work that you do. We know that folks are busy. This work requires a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of energy, and 90 minutes isn't necessarily a short amount of time. So again, appreciate you carving that out to spend some time with us. And just want to acknowledge that this work, though it's a professional choice of ours, and we may be here for work to a degree, but it's also personal a lot of times as well. Myself said that I'm sure a number of you all either have navigated housing insecurity at some point or might be navigating that now, or maybe you got into this work to strengthen your communities or, seeing disparities in your own neighborhoods or in your own families, and that led you into the work that you're doing today to really push back and come together with that. Some folks might be working at organizations that are direct lineages to housing justice work or movement work that have come out of um, some organizing historically. So we come to this work from a number of different ways. So we just, again, want to thank you all for whatever role that you're playing in this, and again, for spending time with us today. In addition to just having our own experiences with housing, both Seth and I have also worked at community development corporations. So we've gotten to see how community-based developers approach housing justice. We've also seen how movement workers approach housing justice. And so we have seen kind of firsthand that there is definitely strength in working together, and also seen that there are some tensions and barriers to navigate and consider as well that are important to discuss. Housing is such a huge topic, and there's a lot of research, of course, around housing. But this area was something we felt like we didn't really see too much explicitly on how housing workers and movement workers work together. How do they partner? What do those partnerships look like? And so this felt like a really important topic to dig deeper into. And we know this stuff isn't new. There's a deep history to housing justice and partnerships. Some particular examples, the Chicago Freedom Movement is one big example of movement work that was housing oriented. We've seen housing show up in the Rainbow Coalition or the American Indian Movement, the Asian American Movement. It's been prominent in movement work, and especially during, again, that civil rights era. We saw a lot of what came from this push towards community. Control and self-determination resulted in folks taking housing into their own hands, and getting into development and establishing these groups and organizations to support housing for their own communities. So history shows us what can happen when there is collaboration between community organizers, developers, policymakers, et cetera. So what's the state of housing partnerships today is something we wanted to look at. So we did a literature review. We looked at some historical articles. We looked at some contemporary articles, um, and really just was looking at just how housing justice is also, it's about people having shelter, but it's also about having access to healthcare, education, economic mobility. All of that stuff is tied into just our ability to have and access shelter, our ability to engage in civic engagement. All of that is tied together, so it's not a siloed thing. And so, in addition to literature review, we felt it was important to talk to folks who are doing this work today on the ground and hear from them. How are they working together, or are they working together? Um, Kind of across these sectors, and in what way. So we had the privilege of engaging a number of folks from place-based organizers, place-based developers to folks that are in national coalitions across the country in red states and blue states, et cetera. So really got a good mix of folks who are really doing this work that we got a chance to talk to. And so what we're here to share with you today are some of the initial findings from that research. Really, really high level. We're hoping the full report will be available within the next month or so, but wanted to give you all kind of a first peek at some of what we found, both between the literature and also the practitioners that we talked to. So we'll look at the findings, and then we'll get a chance to hear from three of our research participants who are in the room together. And then we'll get to spend a little time together as well in breakout groups to meet each other, talk to each other, and just provide opportunity for folks to interact with one another during this time. Um, and before we jump in, we'd definitely like to thank our partners at their Space Action Lab who contracted us to do this research as part of their People's Practice Initiative, Advancing Anti-Racist Community Development. And with that, I would like to hand it over to Monica Copeland, the project director of the People's Practice at their Space Action Lab.
Thanks, Dominique. Thanks everybody for being here. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules, both on the East Coast, West Coast, and it's somewhere in between. Um, I'm Monica Copeland, and I work at Third Space Action Lab. And just in case you don't know about Third Space Action Lab is a Black-owned, woman-led consulting firm or small business based in Cleveland, Ohio. We work on topics such as racial equity and awareness building, program design and management for communities of practice, and facilitation and meaning making with regard to expanding innovative solutions around systemic change. With regard to the People's Practice, which is a project I work on, and that this report came out of. So the People's Practice is a multi-year, multi-strategy initiative funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And our work is to lift up and advance anti-racist community development. So that concept is embedded throughout the whole project. And we do it through working with practitioners and providing research, tools, and inspiration. So we'll be sure to put the websites for both the Third Space Action Lab and the People's Practice in the chat. But again, we're just really happy you're here and that you're interested, and we look forward to sharing highlights from the research. So I'll turn things over to Seth.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Just to get us started, I'm going to do a pretty quick walkthrough of our major findings from the research. I should note that this is a sneak peek of what will be a much fuller report that we'll be making available to folks. And want to keep this as brief as we can, just so that we can get to the folks who are actually doing the work. Dominique kind of walked through a little bit our approach. Really widespread literature review. I should note that we really tried to bring in as many things as we could from 2023, knowing that the housing world is so volatile. And has really shifted from administrations, and as state enabling environments have shifted, and then how housing is feeling in people's lives, what is happening in the market, how folks are addressing that. So most of this we're going to go through really quickly, but I did want to take just a little bit of extra time with this particular slide. We asked the panelists, like, if everything else gets dropped, if folks can only see the really critical things, what sticks out to you that people need to understand? So the first is our central question of the research. Are housing organizations and movement organizations partnering, both in the literature review and in the panel? Vast majority of consensus was yes. This partnering work is happening, but not nearly enough. It's also important to note that this is an ecosystem, that whether you are actively partnering or not, housing work is affecting movements and movement work is affecting housing. And so this is really also about health of an overall housing justice ecosystem. When we talk about housing justice, it's impossible not to recognize that this work is highly racialized. The history of land, wealth, race are deeply entwined, even before our country's formal founding. And it can be really dangerous if we think this work is just inherently anti-racist when we're doing it, if we're not actively being race explicit in our learning, in our strategy, and how we implement the work. It requires constant interrogation, and that includes within partnerships. In the current moment, there's concerns about growing risk aversion in the political climate, social climate, and particularly larger institutional players may be stepping back. That could create a wider gap in between movement work and housing work. At the same time, we want to acknowledge that this work has always been fraught and always has had organized opposition throughout American history. So while this moment is particularly difficult, the truth is there has been difficulty throughout this work. Housing justice work, probably most important for us to recognize when we're talking about partnerships, requires balancing a lot of tensions. There is no single one easy fix. This requires a lot of conversation and a lot of strategy work that can be difficult but necessary because we are looking at emergency relief versus long-term systems change, quick action versus slowness to build relationships and trust. Lots of tensions like that show up in work. We should acknowledge that housing justice work and partnerships between folks that focus on housing and movements has existed for a long time. This is not something new or untested. The truth is that housing movement work has really unlocked a lot of housing protections, housing development, fought back against segregation, fought back against discriminatory housing practices, facing all sorts of marginalized group, folks of color, but also LGBTQ folks, folks living with disabilities, etc. We won't walk through the rest of this in a ton of detail, but suffice it to say, there is value to partnering and to partnering across housing and movement lines, that when we work together, we're able to accomplish things outside of our individual blockages about how housing justice work can work. Also, our organizational blocks, the kind of limitations that we might have within our organization, and then certainly silos within sectors. At the same time, as Dominique acknowledged up top, there are a lot of challenges to doing this type of work. One is just funding constraint, that whenever you're doing collaborative cross-sector work, can be difficult to figure out how to resource it, and resourcing occurs differently in different sectors. And there's not a lot of active multi-organization funding available, particularly incentivizing these types of partnerships at this particular intersection. And because this isn't the norm, working across housing and movement, that this is happening, but not enough, there can be some misunderstandings of what folks are working on, what their industry standards are, the language. There are different timelines, different strategies that can make it difficult, particularly when we've been robbed of this really rich history, that we don't talk enough about how housing justice work has functioned in the past and what it has been able to accomplish. And in the current moment, obviously, with attacks on diversity, equity, inclusion, it can make it more difficult when some partners are more risk averse than others and require more time to reach consensus around how you do the work. This work looks different. I think this is really important, that like when you ask this question, is housing and movement working together? You might think like, are folks who are doing mass mobilization in the streets working with affordable housing developers? And that is a possibility, but there are lots of different configurations, lots of folks focusing on different things in housing and movement work. This is occurring at all different geographic levels. It is occurring in all sorts of different types of communities, working in all sorts of different state enabling environments, emphasizing different challenges and priorities, and offering different things to the overall ecosystem. So one of the most difficult things from the research was just making sense of like, well, how do you compare this housing policy learning coalition to this grassroots neighborhood level group that's fighting for additional affordable housing offerings. So we started to just create four types, and we think this probably has some resonance even beyond housing justice work for any type of coalition work that you might be doing. I don't know if folks have this experience of being in these kind of multi-organization, multi-sector settings, but often like folks will agree about wanting to accomplish something and then get stuck on like, well, why are we spending so much time on this versus this thing that's really important? Um, and I feel like we don't have enough conversations about that. What we found is that folks are approaching this from different ways. So you have groups that are focusing on the who. They're either bringing together similar groups from housing and movement work, or intentionally bringing together different groups to make sense of the two sectors and a little more open on what the group accomplishes or how it gets there. Then you have other types of partnerships that are really oriented toward the action. Like they have a specific thing that they're trying to accomplish, a piece of legislation they're moving, a particular development that they're trying to secure funding for. They have a really strong sense of the what and are open more on who contributes to achieving that what or how you get to that what. Then you have groups that are spending time on the how, that are building both the internal infrastructure to be able to do housing justice work long term and externally as well, thinking about process, thinking about democratic decision making, really being able to prototype the types of housing justice work that we want over the long haul. And then in some circumstances, you have generally smaller groups with already trusted partners that have a really strong sense of who's going to participate, what they're trying to achieve, and how they're going to do it, and can move really quickly to try to achieve some collective action. This is something that all of us, regardless of our position, can contribute to. A lot of this is about establishing relationships with folks we may not have worked with before and doing so with a lot of authenticity and humility and open to learning. At the same time, partnerships benefit from achieving early wins. That doesn't need to be a specific policy or a specific housing intervention. It could be more engagement, more visibility, but demonstrating that there is something that we can do together that we might not be able to do alone. Remaining open to changing contexts because the housing environment is constantly shifting. One of the things we saw in research that really stuck out to us was how many different kind of policy windows were open across the first Trump administration, the Biden administration, and the second Trump administration, and the shifts that folks have to make to respond to that changing environment. But that also affords us opportunities for additional allies that we might not have considered before. New priorities emerge and new tactics that we can try. It's incredibly important to have an equity framework in place across this work, including internal to our partnerships, especially around addressing barriers to participation. There's a lot of attention to centering the folks who are impacted the most by issues like housing vulnerability, but that requires having some attention to the types of housing emergencies that folks can face within a partnership while they're trying to do this type of housing justice work, and not just residents that we might be bringing in, but the housing insecurity that folks, even paid staff, may face doing this work. And then finally, an explicit shared strategy for how you're going to research the collaboration, especially for longer term or larger scale work. This often requires some kind of staffing beyond any individual organization. Funders also play a really critical role in this work. Obviously, longer term general operating support can support these types of collaborations, but additionally, more targeted investments in staffing, organizing, capacity building, thinking through your own funder learning, and spending time understanding how these partnerships work. Every partnership is going to be slightly different. And so understanding how they function, how resources flow through them, having an explicit equity strategy in the housing funding as well as the housing practice is really critical. Being able to leverage your positionality with other funders and in a environment where folks are feeling risk of doing race explicit work or work that has justice in the name, what is the role of funders in bearing some of that perceived risk? And finally, just thinking through how you are evaluating success. This is typically long, patient work that might be as impactful or more impactful as supporting housing development or something that might have a shorter time frame, but is going to require different questions and different ways of reporting and ongoing learning support. And that brings us to the end of our high-level sneak peek findings from the research. I'm going to turn it back over to Dominique to get us involved in a conversation about how that shows up.
Thank you so much, Seth. Yes, excited to bring our panelists out to the stage or the virtual stage, just to add some more texture to what you all just heard from Seth, and going over the findings. So welcome, Kenni, Tara, and Ryan. Thank you all so much for making time for us today. I know y'all are busy because again, y'all are out there doing the thing on the ground, doing this work. So really appreciate you making time to continue to engage with us in this research. Good to see y'all.
Thank you
So
for
would love to
having me.
just, of course, let's just start off just by having each of you introduce yourselves. Tell us a little bit about you and how you came into housing justice. And Tara, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. So I came into the housing justice work actually through experiences in the system. I was in the system, I lived in the system, and I've been working in it for decades. When you look at the background in public housing or in private housing, it kind of gave me that frontline view of what was needed in a way of policy decision making and the way to shape everyday reality for people. And so, being a realtor with those experiences with redlining and lending practices also made me more engaged into this process of how important housing justice work is.
Ryan, I'll pass it to you if that's okay.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to participate and share those findings. They're fantastic. I really do appreciate the contribution to the field. So I'm Ryan Curren. I use he him pronouns. I'm with Race Forward, Director of Housing, Land and Development. And I kind of came into the work through a kind of a through line of, own lived experience through, acute poverty and housing insecurity, then direct service, like worked with homeless teens, navigating the system, and got frustrated by that, and so kind of kept going upstream into policy work at the city of Seattle, and then later at the city of Portland, and now kept going into like systems change work, right? So Race Forward, we're a national intermediary who does systems change work for racial justice, and we apply that lens to housing and land justice, um, and just take all the tools of the civil rights movement and other movements that have, proven to be effective in making change, not just in policy, but in culture and in structures. And so trying to apply that to housing is, an evergreen challenge. So really glad to be in this space, in this community with you all and kind of sharing what works. Yeah, I'll pass it to Kenny.
Thanks. My name is Kenny. I use they them pronouns. I'm the executive director of an organization called South Carolina Tenants Union. I came into housing justice work because the reality of how much it costs to live. I grew up in a preacher and social workers household where my housing was provided for us by my dad's employer, and realized really quickly as in coming to adulthood that there could be another way around housing. My most current work came in here because of the pandemic, and organizing that started in South Carolina. And I stay committed to the work because everything else that I care about stays connected to. If people are able to be housed and to be well, they can show up in their communities in radically different ways. And some of the things that we're most all concerned about are deeply alleviated when people don't have to worry about where they lay their head. So thank you.
I think, Dominique, I didn't do something you asked me to do. I didn't say where I was from, so let me jump back in, please, if I could. So I'm the president of Dayton United for Human Rights, and we kind of carry this role from a broader perspective, from really using the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a basis that housing is a human right. And so I'll be talking a lot about the local systems and reflecting the truth that just not in words, but how we really put it into practice. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Oh, of course. Thank you. I appreciate you coming back around to do that. I'll jump into our next question, which is just what is one thing you feel is particularly important for people to know about housing justice partnerships? If you don't mind me jumping back to you, Tara, just because you mentioned how your work is broad, and I feel like in other conversations you've talked about um, I think just other aspects of housing justice related to like food access and I think a pretty holistic perspective. So would love to start with you and then Kenny and Ryan, feel free to kind of jump in and react to Tara's response.
Well, I think there is one thing that people need to understand about the housing justice is that the partnership is not just about collaboration, it's about shared power. Too often, partnerships are formed for convenience or for funding requirements. They really are more transactional, and organizations come together just to meet a goal, but not necessarily to transform that system. And so, when you look at housing justice, it requires a deeper dive. It requires us to really center those voices and those that are most impacted to help build the structures where those voices is heard and they could be have some influence, right? Um, I would think of one should approach partnerships as a larger ecosystem where you have those interconnections with the housing justice, the food insecurity justices, and the healthcare. Like all of those are interconnected to really have a life in human dignity. And so when you really want to look at true partnerships, it also requires trust. And trust takes time. It requires transparency and really accountability and the willingness to navigate those real hard discomfort conversations, and to be honest about the power dynamics, and really look at the resources you hold, the outcomes you might want, and the benefits of those outcomes. And then, most importantly, the most impactful partners I've seen are those that kind of look beyond the silos and align around more shared values, human dignity, equity, accountability, and they are more or less rooted in relationships and not just outcomes. And they recognize sustainable change does not come from one organization. It comes from a collective commitment to justice. And when you look at Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it reminds us that housing is a human right, and our partnerships must ensure dignity and stable housing for all. Kick it over to Ryan, I guess. If we're kicking it, popcorning.
Sure, I'll follow. I'll draft on that. Tara said it all. That was great. And I also just shout out to Kenny for also. I'm also raised by a social worker. I think all of us who came up with social workers, raised under the table, listening to their conversations, really sharpened our analysis as children of the movement. So I'll follow up on that theme of power, and trust. I think those are the kind of things I was gonna linger on. So, that phrase, progress moves at the speed of trust. You got to build that trust. And so having really clear governing agreements, we talk, Race Forward has a co-governance toolkit that we use to help folks really be clear about how our decisions are made, who has the power, and clearly centering. I think Seth said it earlier, like those most impacted by systemic racism in housing, are closest to the solutions, have accountability in community, or are valid and legit voices. And so where are they positioned in the governance agreement, in terms of making decisions about the agenda and priorities, and then being clear about the guardrails, right, for co-optation, for the challenges that will come to you, including um, like what's the red line that you won't cross when you are asked to compromise your solidarity? Because it's gonna happen. Someone's gonna come and try to divide and conquer. And so what's that red line where you're not gonna leave someone behind? And so I would offer that as a learning. And Kenny, go for it.
Woo, Ryan, it's like you was eavesdropping in meetings from earlier today in my world as I sat at a table with advocacy organizations as we make decisions about legislation and what we're willing to accept. And boy, I wish we had our co-governance tight before we got here. I think some people are going to be upset later today. I think the thing I'll say about partnerships that hasn't already just been named is money also plays a huge role in the ways in which we navigate that. And if we don't have those conversations at the onset, it's really important. This last year for me has been a year of like deep partnership with organizations across the state, particularly around the legislative table. But let's be honest, many of us vying for very similar pools of money and also having different various relationships. And when there has been transparency, things have been a lot easier. When there's not been transparency or not an ability to name the ways in which power shape, like the ways in which money shapes the power we're building or the decisions that we're making, I think that's been a really big challenge. The other thing I'll say is that one of the things I really love about the report is like the naming of these different ways in which partnerships happen and function. And when there's not clarity about what you're doing, there's a lot of unnecessary friction. So it's like there are people that I sit at table with on a regular basis to move statewide legislation forward, and we are never going to agree about the decommodification of housing, and that's okay. But what can we do together, and how can we benefit as many people as we humanly can in real time together? It feels really important. But I think being able to have those conversations as a coming from an organizing background, almost every meeting I have that I go into, I state our desired outcomes and I say like how we are going to be in community together. And I think that's like a really important reality in housing justice partnership realities, to be consistently thinking about like what is our objective as a group or community, or a functioning thing, and then also like how will we be in community together, which I think Ryan named really well around the co-governance realities and the speed of trust. But yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Kenny. Appreciate like the real time examples, and kind of staying with like what folks are experiencing in this moment. How are you all seeing the current political climate impact housing justice work, if at all? Have you seen folks making any adjustments or pivots? And would like to start with Ryan, and that's cool because you particularly at the national level, curious what you're seeing at that scale. And then again, Kenny and Tara, feel free to jump in. But we'd love to start with you, Ryan, if that's cool.
Yeah, and I'll speak to there's kind of three audiences we work with the most. One is like racial equity practitioners in government through our Government Alliance on Race and Equity network, housing justice community organizers. We have a cohort of folks who are doing grassroots organizing, and then mission aligned kind of housing and finance development folks, who are a little more um, in the work of like building and financing housing, and it's impacting all of them, right? So all three are and interesting, um, the solidarity that is starting to occur to like fight for a common cause, right? A common enemy, and it's showing up in kind of two ways, like the kind of the blocking and building framework, right? A lot of time spent blocking, defending these attacks on fair housing, on funding. Um, Now with these kind of frivolous investigations into this like idea of reverse racism, right? So a lot of time spent defending that, but then also continuing to build, right, locally, right? The best, national defense is a local offense. Folks are saying, and continuing to make uh, gains locally in spite of the federal attacks. So, organizing for social housing funds, renters' rights, right, zoning reform, and you're still seeing some of this local control. Um, and and some of the attacks are intersectional, right? Like you're seeing like the new mixed status housing policy, right, is really bringing folks in the immigration and the housing space together. So movement and housing justice folks are organizing together in solidarity. You saw it in like when ICE came to LA, a number of folks in the housing justice community were mobilizing their members to support folks under attack, right? So that there's some examples of how that intersectional solidarity is starting to show up because of some of the attacks. So that's a little bit of what we're seeing. The big pivots I think are legal and narrative, like a lot more emphasis on like regaining the narrative uh, because it's been taken from us, right? Like in terms of DEI, I mean, even in terms of housing, you can argue. We can talk a little bit about um, you know, the narrative around decommodification versus more market kind of supply side narratives, and how the current federal government is very like, it's a real estate developer, right, who is running the country. So that narrative piece, and then legal. I think I've met more people who've now read the Fair Housing Act that had not before. Like we are sharpening our pencil on what the law actually says, because the law is not going to defend us. We need to defend the law. And that is where folks are starting to spend a little more time, which is good. I mean, we all needed to get a little smarter on actually what is the legal landscape, so that and so that we can improve it. So I'm seeing both the blocking and the building.
National landscape wise or larger political landscape wise, I think it's been really interesting to have conversations with people and realize that a lot of what we sometimes we're thought or socialized to believe about how laws are made or who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. I think this current moment has kind of toppled for people on both sides of aisles around like what might be possible. And so I think what I'm seeing um, are two things. One is like the possibility, um, because there are lots of things collapsing on one another, and so if they small scale developers and tenant organizers have a lot more in common than I said we would have had 5 years ago. And I think that there are also opportunities, for example, like in my state, where I think South Carolina makes headlines for lots of reasons, but usually not for housing justice strides. And I think because of the vacuum of so many things happening, there have been a lot of unlikely partnerships developed to see the start of some deeper tenant protection policy work move forward. The other thing that I think is happening is I would like I said, someone who spends a lot of their time like in the community organizing space or like larger social justice movement spaces. I think we're also seeing this moment of like paralysis for some folks. People are overwhelmed by the news cycles, and then I think people are. And I say in the most loving way, getting trapped into like outward actions, but not consistent action. So I think there are a lot of things to be said about the No Kings rallies and the ways in which people get an opportunity to speak out about the things that they're concerned about. But I've had a lot of opportunity this year to try to work with some of the folks that are organizing those things or attending those things and pulling them into concrete daily, weekly actions that will yield deep fruit in the housing justice world. And crickets, lots of I would say like rejection sensitivity. So like it's really fun to make a sign and to be on the news and to be surrounded with hundreds of other people. It's actually really hard to be consistent every day and show up or every week and ask new people into a space or to, be vulnerable. And so I think in some ways, on one hand, we're like, there's all these incredible opportunities to think through because of so much things that we're under fight. We're like, how can we fight together or do a thing differently? And at the same time, we're like really faced with like this strange like apathy that like on its face value looks like something exciting is happening, but on the other side makes it actually really challenging to move people into consistent action, which is what we'll know will yield bigger work. And so that's something I'm noticing as I talk to other movement friends and even in our coalition spaces as we're like working consistently to move things that people will click a love on a social media post, but not necessarily lean into what happens next.
I want to pick up where Kenni left off is it's really important to uplift the comments that she said. Myself was a part of this recent No Kings rally this weekend, and I look at that as thousands of people in this space. But what I didn't see was how do we move forward with action or how we move forward with solutions with the things that we know is going on. So, and one thing it's great to get together, like she said, and really talk about it. But part of my speech was, what will be your impact when you leave here? And so, a lot of what I see is that people want to see it. Some people may not understand how to go do something, and others may be afraid. And so, just to go back to some of the work that I see locally, is that we're currently taking a look at some of the laws that are on the books as it relates to housing to see if our government are really uplifting those laws or ordinances that currently exist. Some of the things that we've saw are outdated or they haven't really uplifted them in years. And so really being intentional as we mobilize in this movement to really look at what are those laws that exist now and how do we mobilize around those to try to see if we can get some change. And then really intentionally organize. I think the real stronger emphasis on coalition building around local leadership and community driven solutions. When you look at really organizations doing this work, as I said before, we can't do it alone, and it must be that we work towards shared resources and work towards aligning our work on a broader spectrum, like a human rights movement that we're doing actually here in Dayton. I do see the opportunity to deepen this work. But again, those systems and uncertainty becomes essential to the how we move it forward. But I think that this is where democracy will show up. And what a lot of us are using is using voting. Okay, really educating around voting at this point to really move the needle for our housing justice. I really think it's important for people to come together to advocate and to educate and to hold systems accountable. I mean, at the end of the day, this shifts the needle, and it gives us a chance to reframe the conversation on what can be proved or what can be done to what must we guarantee, and then actually create and be innovative in moving and building a shared power and a shared future for everyone.
Thank you so much for that. And I think each of you has mentioned or referenced essentially it's like tactics kind of from the civil rights movement, and some of that still showing up today, or even referencing like the Fair Housing Act and really kind of looking back in a sense of what has been done to move this work forward. And also you mentioned even still being innovative, I think today. What do you think about the role of history and how we approach housing justice work now? I'll jump to you, Kenny, if that's cool, because even like tenant unions have such a rich history as well. So, and you were sitting kind of really at this kind of nexus of like housing and organizing, and we'll love to just start with you, if that's good.
Yeah,
Share
that's
with some.
great. Yeah, love history, love the ways in which it's a companion and a guide and a grounding piece for people. I think it's really, people are overwhelmed by the reality in which we're living in. And I think history actually helps us tell some stories and like helps us align and help people see connection points. So for a not as well known fact is like Martin Luther King participated in a lot of tenant organizing. And so when we get to think about the plight of a tenant, we think about um, the impact of war, we think about poverty. We're able to have really great conversations about how this is not a new point in history that we're living in. This is actually a revisiting. And so how do people survive, organize, strategize in those times, and then what could that look like for us now? And then it's a good year to be a tenant organizer. Like I'm able to point in so many different directions to success of tenant unions that's happening now as a result of like pedagogy methodology that comes from history. We can look to like places like New York City, where there is a mayor that was elected in part by lots of tenants and their organizing, and where they've been able to hold and deep accountability practice of greater access for tenants and protections there that stems on a history of decades of tenant organizing. Or I can point down to the South, like in Kentucky, where we saw one of the first collectively bargained leases happening because of the work of a tenant union. And that work sits on top of one another. I've just explained to my people, like, it didn't take overnight for us to get here, and it ain't gonna take overnight for a new reality to place. But it's really easy to look at both stretching history, so like to look decades back, hundreds of years back, but also to be able to look like 6 months ago, 2 weeks ago, like yesterday, and see the ways in which tenant organizing realities are like actually yielding incredible, innovative, justice-filled housing realities. And so for me, like history has just been a great companion and a great leveler. And as I think about what I keep thinking of as an unlucky partnership, sort of like I've had a lot of conversations with landlords and property managers. In fact, they're like on my speed dial right now as I move through a legislative cycle talking about evictions. I'm also reminded in ways in which other people have like really thought about land ownership, whether that be co-ops, land trusts, and seeing the ways in which those historically have existed in books like Collective Courage, or seeing the ways in which peers across the country are figuring it out for themselves, like mobile home parks purchasing their own property, et cetera. So history's been a great companion for both grounding and also figuring out strategy and understanding how long it actually takes to do this work that our heart dreams of. And I'm happy to pass it to either Ryan or Tara to pick up.
Ryan, you want to go next?
Sure. I'll jump in. Um, that line, we're planting seeds for trees of which the shade we will not enjoy, like that, and that folks have planted those seeds for us now, right? And so I think of those eras in which they did that and appreciate and what are the lessons from it, right? I mean, obviously the civil rights legislation is something that we cherish and are defending daily. And so some of the wins from that are approaching or are shaping our approach now, is thinking about how the community power created through the MLK and the civil rights movement, coupled with the governing power of LBJ, and thinking about that question. This is a good one for all audiences, is like, who had more power, LBJ or MLK? And just the fact that you can ask that question and not quite sure the answer is illustrative of how critical the community power and the governing power needs to be paired together. And a lesson also is like, once you win that policy and get that program, like you must implement with integrity. And so, that the other line, a program is where the movement goes to die. Like, no, the program needs to be cyclical, giving back so that community capacity and organizing is strengthened through that. And so that's definitely informing our approach around co-governance and this kind of inside-outside strategy with allies in government and community organizers to bring the best of both together for the long term, not just for the win, right? For the long term. Um, and I'm hoping this is a moment where we bring back a lesson from the civil rights of the moral clarity and authority that they brought. I mean, part of it was, a pastor, right, with the ability to kind of bring that. But I think that's something that is lacking that our narrative work is starting to bring up. Like bringing a moral clarity to this work actually brings more people into it. As long as you're not um, kind of like that morally superior piece, that sanctimony that some of us we can fall into. Avoid that, but still with moral clarity, it really does bring more people into the movement for housing justice. And I hope we can all be a little more unashamed about that and really lead with our values. Tara?
Yeah, sure. When I look at it, history is really the foundation, and we must really actively engage in it in order to really understand those systems that we are working within today. When you look at policies like redlining, segregation, discriminatory lending practices, and disinvestment in certain communities, um, it's a pattern that has been created that still exists. These are just not historical events. They are structures that have shaped access to opportunity, access to wealth, and stability across generations. If we approach the housing justice without acknowledging that history, we risk creating solutions that are incomplete and could be even harmful. Um, we may end up even not addressing the real root cause. But history also provides us with a lesson of resilience and resistance. Communities have always organized, advocated, and built systems where formal systems has failed them. That legacy is just important as the policies that created the harm. I believe that understanding history is a part of accountability. It always asks this question, which better question, who has been left out? Who has been harmed? What does repair look like? And how do we really have, and I keep saying this everywhere, every place I'm in or every space I'm in, how do we real have those real conversations and address historical trauma? It always allows us to be intentional and to help build the future that we want to see. But it also looks at not just fixing it that is broken, but creating a system that is kind of equitable by design. So when you look at what's going on here in Dayton, we're going back to see, how could we really take on that ownership to own land, to have those build those cooperatives, or be in a position to have that power as a community, and not let the institutions lead us in a way that defines what we want to see it. And so that's why we're really trying to work to declare Dayton to be the first human rights city in Ohio. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Oh, that was a nice way to to end that. I want to try to squeeze in one last question, um, really quickly, because it's obviously a big theme here is we're talking about partnerships, and all of you have really doubled down on the importance of working together, communities work together, coalition building. So the question I want to close out with is why do you think this work tends to be siloed in the first place, right? Like our lives aren't actually siloed. Why is this work siloed? And are there particular challenges you think folks should understand about developing housing justice partnerships? Again, kind of given that this work does tend to be siloed. Anybody can jump in.
Hmm. Well, I guess I'll go on and get mine over with. Let me see. I think partnerships that work best are really those that are community centered, cross sectored, and grounded in shared values. I've seen partnerships succeed. When you look at grassroots, you really have the grassroots, you have the institutions, and you community members at the table. and in a way that it respects each group's role and expertise. Community members have just much lived experience and expertise as the institutions. And then when you look at grassroots, bringing the accountability and trust, institutions will bring those resources and the infrastructure, and then the community members will bring the insight and those lived experiences and vision. And then what we do is we make these partnerships effective in a way, and we tend to learn how to co-create and move anything forward. I think what is important is to build that trust, transparency, and consistency, create those spaces with shared decision making, not just consultation, right? Not just listening sessions, and really prioritize communication in a way to navigate together. And I think another key factor is really having a human rights framework around dignity, equity, and justice. It really creates a strong foundation for collaboration. It moves the partnerships beyond basically that individual agenda to more of a shared purpose. And DUHR is currently building that ecosystem where we've established a alliance along all of those different cross sectors, organizations, and institutions to really have that successful partnership for the larger, broader ideal of how do we really be intentional on coming to the table and really addressing those things that we really have difficult of really talking about. And then lastly, really understanding what that shared future looks like for everyone at the table. I really think it's important for us to step away from those silos because what we know yesterday is gone. We can't get a grant by ourselves any longer. They want to see more collaboration. Instead of us fighting over a grant, let's sit down at the table and understand how we can get that $1 million together. Thank you.
Kenny, where you going? You go. All right. We all follow that up and I always like to say, like Tara mentioned the $1 million. I'm like, and how can we add a zero to it? You know? Like let's grow the pie
Yes.
together, we don't need to split it. Um and because collaboration you can do more together. And so
Mhm.
and it brings greater wisdom and resources and those and that wisdom and expertise should be compensated,
Honey, you want
right?
to come up here?
So some challenges that we see is, really a lack of alignment and commitment to a shared vision for racial equity. If you don't have that, what is your North Star? What are you working toward? What are your shared values? Um, and that can be a real big issue when you have an institutional partner, right? If it's lip service, it will show up eventually. So whereas the organizational change and structural change within institutions that show that commitment, and on the community side, like the base building and accountability to a broader um, community. Like if you're not doing that base building, like it's just a few community leaders who can say they're representative but aren't, right? So both that accountability is important. And then timeline conflicts, like it's easy. You might have a partner who's very campaign cycle focused or real estate cycle focused, and a movement building is longer term, right? It's beyond the political cycle. It's generational, right? And that goes back to, and then the last challenge is funding, right? Funding is also ends up on that cycle.
Yes.
And so then you end up with gaps in capacity and partners fall off and can fall apart. Um, and even if you do have all the funding and all the people at the table, like if you have the inequitable funding and inequitable decision-making agreements, it'll all fall apart. So
Mhm.
again, just having those governance agreements really in place. I appreciated this research's finding around, more joint learning and coordination between um, government, housing practitioners, and those, advancing housing justice approaches. I think that's, getting more points of contact, more opportunities to be in the room together um, is important and can lead to that's kind of the germination of future partnerships. So that's all to say. Y'all are invited. Facing Race, Raleigh, North Carolina, November. 2026, it's a place where advocates, organizers, strategists and cultural and artist strategists come together, elected leaders, government practitioners, and try to make sense of the moment after the election. And I think that's also a place to make partnerships, and we just need more spaces like that because it's hard to do on Zoom. So,
Mhm.
but I'm glad to be here on Zoom with you all. Uh, Kenny, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, I really appreciate both of y'all sharing around the silo reality. I think I live in South Carolina, and so I like to talk to people about what a lot of people think about when we're thinking about partnerships or relationships is like this idea of crabs in a barrel. And so if we're put into a situation in which we have to fight for something or don't have space to exist, then people often will leave that space not wanting to gather or congregate again. And a mentor of mine talks about how crabs don't naturally occur in a basket or a barrel. Someone put them there. And so I think a lot of the work of like pulling groups together and out of silos is talking about the reality of like how we got to the moment that we're in, and really making sure people are equipped to understand that like um, each one of us has different form and function, but there's a lot for each one of us to bring to the table, particularly when we're like really clear about what the vision and the work is moving forward. And so that takes time to build that reality out. And so, like, what does it mean for us to have short and long term goal realities? Some of the coalition work that I'm doing right now, it's not explicitly housing justice focused, but it's taken us 3 years to get to a space of like doing shared programming or work together that makes sense. And a lot of that has been really slow. Like we gonna have dinner together. No, literally, we're called the liberation dinners. Dinner together, local leaders, understanding what other folks are up to, and then understanding what folks' capacity looks like. So I think a lot of the silo work is going to like a lot of what it takes for us to get out of out of silo actually also requires us to like really really mindful, really honest about what's possible, and to approach that space with deep clarity so that we're not hurting one another, stepping over one another, or setting our movement and our work back.
Dominique, if I can just step in to just share something that Kenny just said, is that the capacity, it came to me. This work, this work, capacity, if I can clone myself 10 times, it still wouldn't be enough. The capacity to move the movement or the work forward is just not there. Um, we need everyone to come to the table to help us, whether it's the children, the students, the youth, the grandmas, the uncles, everyone. Because capacity, I can tell you, I probably can speak for Kenny and Ryan that we tired right now, but we know that we must move forward and keep the work moving. And so that's where we try to really understand what is those actionable things that we can really ask people going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent way to conclude. Thank you all so much for being on this panel. And want to also just invite the three of you too, if there are ways that people can follow your work or stay in touch or anything you want to share with the folks in the room, please feel free to drop it in the chat. And we also on our end can send it in an email to folks after the fact, but you're welcome to do that. And with that same collective spirit, looking forward to jumping into some breakout rooms. Again, it's important to not just share, research drops all the time. So we wanted to create a space for us to engage around it, for you to hear from the folks who are doing the thing and also engage in the research, but wanted to also provide an opportunity for you all to engage with each other around this topic. So we'll go into some breakouts. We have 3 prompts. Each room can choose one particular prompt that you want to spend some time discussing as a group, and then we'll come back together after the fact. There's not a whole lot of time, but no worries. We do plan on doing some more webinars with our People's Practice partners, so stay tuned for other opportunities to engage as well. But we will break out. The 3 questions are one is, are there specific lessons or tactics from the past that we might be able to learn from in today's housing environment? The second question is, what are some easy ways to get housing workers and movement workers to collaborate more? And the third question is, what are some things that people, like the people in this meeting, could do together to strengthen housing justice work across the country? Are there ways that we could support housing justice even in a difficult environment and without a lot more resourcing? So choose one, and looking forward to hearing what folks talk about in their rooms.
Welcome back, folks. We're gonna give just a few more seconds for the full room to get here. I think we should have more than 11 people, unless a whole bunch of introverts logged off. But we'll wait just a second. Uh, Hope everyone has enjoyed this. I found it to be a really rich conversation, and anytime we get to spend time with our housing justice panelists, um, I feel enriched by the knowledge, but also hopeful about a dark time uh, in which a lot of the light is peeking through because of people's hard work. So just want to extend my gratitude to our three panelists today, and then to the People's Practice staff for making this possible. If folks have not checked out the People's Practice website, please do so. It is a wealth of information about anti-racist community development, about learnings, about promising practices that people are putting into action all across the country. There is currently an issue up on overlooked geographies in community development with a real strong focus on tribal, rural, and suburban communities. So very much would encourage folks to check that out. We won't have time for a full report out, but did want to open up the mic if folks had anything that they wanted to share that just really inspired them from their breakout. Um, so I'm going to mute briefly, and if folks could either unmute in a very courteous manner or use the raise hand function, would appreciate it.
Just jump in and say the first breakout was really nice. I got to meet um, some ladies from Florida, Minnesota, and really, really talk and listen. I wasn't the one talking this time. I wanted to listen to a lot of the organizing things that they were going in their respective cities. And it really gave me a chance to reimagine how I would really move the Dayton Human Rights Alliance forward, so that's a separate thing from Dayton United for Human Rights Coalition. So and they gave me some ideas to really think about as it relates to governance and really the focus of trust.
Thanks for that, Tara. Other connections that folks made or work that they got really excited to hear about?
Yeah, I was really excited to hear about the regional action plan happening in Minnesota with Juhi and Tara. Like it's great to come together because we are doing the same work in different areas, right? And there's a lot of overlap. And I think that just opened up it really that breakout was an answer to question three. Like, how do we really use our resources? And we are the resources. So I think sharing our notes, being thoughts leaders, like, hey, this is what my governance structure look like. What you think? Do you think this can work for you? Especially during this foundational level, because we know that our organizations and our movements are as strong as our foundations. And I feel like a lot of our, especially Black and Brown led organizations, suffer because their governance is not sound. We want to jump into the action, but don't want to take the time to build trust. Don't want to take time to make a governance model that works for us culturally and spiritually, not just a copy and paste of what traditional nonprofit structure looks like or organization structures look like. For us, we are spiritual people. We need a spiritual piece. We need an accountability piece, a part of our governance. We need a culture piece, a part of our governance. So yeah.
Ryan, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I'll just reiterate, part of Race Forward's answer to number three is facing race. So I hope you all come. Raleigh, North Carolina, November. Make meaning of that political moment. And then for number two, like easier ways to, collaborate across housing justice and movement organizers. Ray Green just listed off a couple of spaces that he's in where that is happening, and it just made me realize like I don't know a lot of them. Like they exist. Do folks on this call know like where are I know People's Action, Alliance for Housing Justice. Like where are the places right to the city? Like who's doing this bridging right now? That's just a question to the group, and maybe there could be like a follow-up list of links to like where's this going on already? I know I'm curious. I'm gonna start researching it.
I agree.
Yeah, and I will plug, we'll certainly be sending some follow-up materials. Folks will get access to the deck as well as the audio recording. Um, and we plan to continue these webinars. So it might not be narrowly around housing justice partnerships, but additional priority topics that are important for folks that are doing this kind of organizing work and development work. So please stay tuned on that front. To our panelists, to the broader panel, the 13 people who contributed to the research, and most importantly, to all of you for making the time. As Dominique said, we know there is a lot going on in the world right now. So to dedicate 90 minutes of your Wednesday afternoon to making community with us and sharing in this learning means a lot to us. We're really excited. We hope you'll stay in touch, and we definitely hope that you'll continue to engage in all the different people of practice resources that are out there, and helping us get the research out as we start to release the full report. But just immense gratitude, and I hope you are leaving with new thoughts and a lighter heart as we head into the rest of our week. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank
Have
you
a
Good
good
one.
day.
so much. Thank you.